The 1960s was a decade when almost every minority group in America, but mainly the women, were fighting to be granted equal rights in housing, employment, and other areas. At this time, women made up the majority of the United States. They still continue to face the gender discrimination through most of the decade. Although the counterculture was trying to change the world, attitudes towards women had changed little since the 1950s. A large majority of the American women in the 1960s were mothers and housewives. Many were active volunteers at churches, schools, the PTA, and other various of charities. However, in business and politics, women continue to find themselves in a world controlled almost exclusively by men. And with a few notable exceptions, only a tiny percentage of women were doctors, lawyers, politicians, and corporate executives.
The feminist outcry during the 1960s is often referred to as the second wave of the women's movement or the women's liberation movement. During the 1940s post-war boom, the conception of this feministic protest was undoubtedly instigated by the uniform desire for a return to the pre-war patriarchal society. Television broadcasting of Fathers Know Best and Leave It to Beaver was eminent testimony to the belittling perception of women in society and, more specifically, in the household. In addition to such indirect dehumanizing methods, females received the label other, terminology implying the connotation of being unimportant or secondary sex. This identification was apparently justified as women were capable of pregnancy, lactating, and menstruating. In other words, the second sex was too prone to emotional roller coasters and was thus seen as inferior. Having pervaded much of the 60s and 70s, the second wave addressed the unofficial de facto inequalities and official legal inequalities bestowed upon women, sexuality implications, the family model, the workplace, and perhaps most controversially, reproductive rights. In its totality, the feminist movement attempted to incorporate equal rights for women into the United States Constitution, an endeavor which never met fruition.
During the 60s, I think one of the most significant advancements was the creation of the Women's Studies programs, which sought to change curriculum. It sought to include the histories of women in more traditional disciplines. So that was one step, because you're working within an institution, which is what the women of the 1920s didn't really have as much success doing, working and achieving revolutionary change within those structures. But the women in the 1960s and 70s were more educated by then. They had equal access to higher education, so they were able to affect change in that way. They also, one of their platform issues was also reproductive rights, which wasn't just the whole choice debate, but it had more to do with reproductive justice and women claiming control over their bodies. And when women claim control over their bodies and authority over their bodies, then that has very far-reaching implications in other areas. So I would say that in terms of their advancement within the universities and as far as reproductive rights, that was probably what helped advance women the most during that time.